Hello everybody, and welcome back to yet another Lingua Carpa video. Today, we're talking about the hardest language in the world. Maybe? Kind of? One of the questions that I got most commonly in the classroom, especially with new students, Carp, what is the hardest language in the world? What's the most difficult language to learn in the whole world? So, I would like to address that today, because I know there's lots of folks out there who are curious about that. And there's some nuance to it. Let's dive in. So what's the hardest language in the world? First part, welcome. Hey, we did that part. Next, identifying bias and rephrasing the question. So as turns out, the question, what's the hardest language in the world, might not actually even be a really good question. The curiosity is good, but the question might be worded wrong. We'll see what I mean by that. Afterwards, what makes languages difficult? So before we can say which one is the hardest or the most difficult language, what makes them that way? And then last but certainly not least, the hardest language is in the world, kinda? It's complicated, like most things in language. Here we go. Identifying bias and rephrasing the question. When my students used to ask me, Carp, what's the hardest language in the world? Well, bud, who's asking? It depends who's asking. This is important because this is where we need to identify bias. So your language, whatever your native language is, that's your language that's normal to you. And of course, for people who've thought about this before or who have more experience, you realize, well, that's normal to you, but it's not normal to everyone, right? So an English speaker thinking in English, that's normal to us. A Spanish speaker thinking in Spanish and looking at the world from that perspective or that lens, which is language and culture related, by the way, that's normal to them. And so we can't ignore that. Unfortunately, Americans are kind of notorious for forgetting to check this bias, forgetting that this bias exists. Like, well, me and my family and the people I know, we live our lives in this language, in this way, and that's normal because that's how we do it. And I'm normal. Unfortunately, that's a pretty egocentric way of thinking and looking at the world. And I'm not here to scold anybody. It's just really important that we are self-aware and we understand there's a lot more going on outside in the whole world. The world is a very big place. It's important that we recognize that and understand that the hardest language for a speaker of one language, say English, is different than the hardest language for somebody who naturally speaks a different language. Okay? So that's checking our bias. Now let's rephrase the question. Like I said, what's the hardest language for a native English speaker? Now, let's move on. What makes languages difficult? It's really, honestly, very simple, but let's break it down a little bit. Really, what makes it difficult? Well, the differences from your native language. Since all languages use different grammar or syntax, things like that, the more different it gets from your native language, the harder it is. We will look at some examples of that in a moment. So complexity is really made up of all these different things. It's made up of the grammar of the language, of the syntax of the language. It's made up of the volume of vocab. For example, some languages have tons of synonyms, and some languages have many fewer synonyms. So you may only need, especially on certain topics, you may only need a smaller pool of vocab to sort of cover all your bases, whereas to have really good, strong nuance in a different language, you may need a higher volume of vocabulary. Also, in some languages, such as Japanese, you may have the same character that can be called two different things. Okay, just a side note here. I said two different readings there, and that's really a low estimate. Almost all kanji have at least two readings, but many of them have a lot more. Like this one. Wow, look at all those. Isn't that fun? That sound completely different depending on what that character is being used to express, which, if that sounds confusing, it's crazy. With that in mind, let's look at some examples. We will compare a few sentences today. Here in English, we have a very simple sentence. I have an apple. Great. I love me some good apple.
How do you like them apples?
French. Here's the same sentence. J'ai une pomme. Okay. Now we're going to look at that same sentence in Japanese. Ringo o mottemasu. Now, let's break these down just a little bit to really highlight the differences here and why some may be more difficult than others. So on this slide, I've got a little color code for you. You can see we have subject, verb, article, object, and then this other one at the end, object marking particle. That might sound a little crazy because it is. So in English, we have a subject, then a verb, then an article, then an object. I have an apple. All right, let's look at French. In French, j'ai une pomme. Already, we can see the colors line up the same. That tells us, in this example at the very least, that French and English are very similar. All the words are lined up the same, so the syntax, the structure of these sentences is very, very similar. That means, in this context at least, that French is probably not that difficult for an English speaker, as opposed to something else like, I don't know, what we're about to see with Japanese. Let's look at that. Oh boy. So right off the bat, you may notice that there are only 3 colors in the Japanese sentence, and there is no subject. First, we have the object. In English and French, those are the end of the sentence. In Japanese, it's in the front. This isn't always true, but for this example, it is. Then we have the object marking particle, a very particular piece that for an English or French speaker, this is a kind of a weird piece of language that you have to get used to. And then we have the verb at the end, which is oddly, it's like a super long word. But anyway, it's at the end of the sentence. And the object's at the beginning. The subject is nowhere to be found, and there's no article. So like, what the heck is going on? From an example like this, you can see that obviously, for an English speaker, French is probably a lot easier to learn than Japanese. And let me tell you, it is. Oh boy, Japanese is a doozy. But let's move on for now. So what makes languages difficult? We talked about differences. The next big thing is pronunciation, which of course is limited to the speaking part of the language. You've got to make these sounds with your mouth. And that is not always easy. So learning to make new sounds later in life can be near impossible. You notice how basically everybody from their native language can make all of those sounds correctly. They just do, because they've been doing it forever. They've heard those noises, those sounds, those phonemes their entire lives. They've practiced them their entire lives. They know how to make the sounds. It's natural to them. And so if you have that and you don't have exposure to another language or practice with another one until much later in life, it can be genuinely very hard or near impossible to make those sounds correctly, or at least in a comfortable and fluid way. Here are some such examples. Okay, these are all R related, but I find that this is a great example for this problem. Take the Spanish R. So first we have the English R, that weird R. I don't know if I feel like a pirate or a growling animal or what. That's our English R. So compare that to a Spanish R. Like Spanish words like manera. That's a single R. Then you have the rolled R, that's R sound. Very distinct from an English R. And I know people, like some of my students who I tutor, that have trouble making that sound. It can be challenging. Then you have the French R. It's also very different, like rouge or route. That sound is all the way back in your throat. That is obviously very different from the English and the Spanish. And then we have the Japanese R or L. And I want to say the Japanese R or L because the Japanese sound for this is sort of between the two. And I'm using this as an example because it is also very different. On this line, you have all the different sounds. These are in hiragana and katakana. I guess in English, we would call these the R sounds in Japanese. So we have ra, ri, ru, de, do. And then the same 5 sounds on the right, ra, ri, ru, de, do. So in Japanese, these sounds sort of fall between maybe what we would consider an R or an L. They can also be very similar to that Spanish R where it's your tongue is sort of rolling off the roof of your mouth. And all of this is to say that these pronunciations can be really specific and very difficult for people to master if you did not grow up hearing this and practicing this your whole life. That isn't to say that you cannot do it, but sometimes it's very, very hard. So what is the hardest language for English speakers? Well, this work has already mostly been done for us. I mean, I could give my own opinions and guesses at this, but I don't have knowledge in all of these languages. And there's an excellent page right here from the U.S. Department of State on foreign language training. And I will leave this link in the description so you guys can find this. I'm not here to read everything on this page today, but we're going to drop down to the section where they sort of sort the languages and talk about the estimated difficulty of each. So we have category 1, 2, 3, and 4 languages. Category 1 languages, they estimate that you would need about 600 to 750 class hours to reach, how do they say it? General professional proficiency. On category 1, they're saying this would take about 600 to 750 class hours. That's a lot of time. And these would be languages considered similar to English. You can see here Danish, Dutch, French, Italian, Norwegian, Portuguese, Romanian, Spanish, Swedish. And you can see the time estimate too. Most of these are 24 weeks. French and Spanish actually at 30 weeks. It says Italian is 24 weeks, which I find surprising. I know a little bit of Italian, and honestly, I found it to be more challenging than Spanish and French. So, hey, I have limited experience. I'm not the expert here, but I find that curious. These are category 1. They're very similar to English. If you're in a French class or Spanish class or a Danish class or a Portuguese class, whatever, and you find it difficult, just remember, you've got it easy because it's going to get way worse, like a lot worse. So let's take the low estimate, 600 class hours to reach a general professional proficiency level. Okay. Now category 2, approximately 900 class hours. So that's already 1.5 times the base hours. That's a lot of time. We've got German, Haitian Creole, Indonesian, Malay, and Swahili. Let's keep going. Now we're into category 3 languages, quote unquote hard languages. Yes. Significant linguistic and or cultural differences. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, culture is still a big part of this. I'm mostly just talking about language, but you cannot ignore it. And it is a key piece of how communication works, period. There are other forms of politeness or certain ways of speaking that, aside from strict grammar, you have to be aware of and have to be able to use in order to really use the language correctly and proficiently. So they're estimating 1,100 class hours. That is 200 more hours than category 2. Again, that's a lot of time, okay? So we went from 600 in category 1 to 900 category 2, then 1,100 in category 3, but just you wait, because we're about to see category 4. Well, first, category 3 language list is very big. Look at all these. These are all lumped into one group. There's a lot. Language is a tough thing to do. And so most of them fall in here for English speakers, we could assume. Now for the big reveal, category 4. Category 4 languages have an estimate of 2,200, yes, 2,200 class hours. If you're keeping track, that is double. That is double category 3. So if category 3 is already that difficult, these are considered the hard languages. Category 4 is double that time. That is wild. That is insane. And these are dubbed the super hard languages that are exceptionally difficult for native English speakers. And oh, would you look at that? Carp's favorite current language he's learning is on the list. Oh God, what have I done? I chose my own suffering. I know what I got myself into. It's okay. And obviously, these are ones that are exceptionally different, which is why they are exceptionally difficult for native English speakers. So what are the hardest languages to learn for English speakers? I would guess those 5 right there. Arabic, Cantonese, Mandarin, both Chinese, of course, then Japanese and Korean. And I don't think this is in order. This is just alphabetical. So all 5 of these are estimated to be the hardest languages in the world for English speakers. So what a long video just for me to tell you that's the short answer to the question. It's one of those 5. Those are the hardest languages. At any rate, regardless of where your language falls on the list, don't let it intimidate you. Yes, some of them might take a lot more time because they might just be more difficult. But if you're genuinely interested in language or you have a real need to learn that one, it's going to work out. It might take more time, but it's going to work out. And for people who are self-motivated and you're purely learning for your own growth and your own enjoyment, really, don't let it scare you away. Dive into what you care about and work at what you're interested in, because if that's true, then you will succeed in it. It's just going to take maybe some more time, maybe double or triple or quadruple the time, but you will get there. You can get there. Okay. That's all for today. Thank you for joining me for another video. I hope you enjoyed and learned something fun. And if you are learning or you are studying language right now, let me know which one it is. Go to the website and check out which category it's in and let me know. Until next time, language learners. Ciao.